GrailOfTruth.com presents a Bible video series on the book of Daniel. Daniel Decoded, Part 1. Proof Your History Books Are Wrong. Okay, so this video series, or this particular part of this video series is going to deal with the chronology surrounding the book of Daniel in the Bible. And this is going to be geared more towards somebody who has a familiar knowledge of the book of Daniel and the chronology of it and the events surrounding it. If you don't, a lot of this might be over your head, but basically what we're talking about here is a portion of the Bible that deals with the Babylonian captivity, which is the time that the ancient nation of Israel was taken into captivity by the nation of Babylon, and they served them for 70 years. And when they were taken into captivity, the Babylonians burned down their temple, and then 70 years later they were able to return again to rebuild their temple under the decree of a king by the name of Cyrus, who was a king of the Medo-Persian Empire, who ended up taking over the Babylonian Empire and let the Jewish people go home to rebuild their temple. So that's what we're dealing with here, and it's events that took place, depending on your chronology, 400 to 600 years before Christ, and when the Jewish people returned, when ancient Israel returned home from the Babylonian captivity, they rebuilt their temple, and it stood all the way up until about 70 AD, which was roughly 40 years after Jesus began his ministry. And at that point in time, the Romans came down and burned down that second temple. And then the Jews were again sent into diaspora or captivity throughout all the nations, and they did not become a nation again until 1948. And at this point in time in history, there is no third temple yet built, but that is one of the question marks: is are they going to build a third temple now that they're reclaiming the homeland in Israel? So that's what this is referring to. Now, what I'm going to show you here is, because it talks about these events in the book of Daniel, that the chronology that most people in Christianity, in the Judeo-Christian worldview, have for the events of the book of Daniel is completely wrong, and it's not their fault. It's because the history books are wrong. But if one really gets in and studies the Bible and compares and contrasts the chronologies listed there, it becomes very apparent what the real chronology of history is. And then when you get into the historical record, you will find out that the historical record actually backs up what the Bible is saying and does not back up what the history books are saying. And so that's what this particular video is going to be about. So what I'm going to show you here is that the current understanding of when the Babylonian captivity occurred is roughly about 130 to 150 years off. The Babylonian captivity actually occurred in the 400s BC as opposed to the 500s BC. So what you're looking at is the Wikipedia page that lists the kings of Babylon during the time of the Babylonian captivity. And according to the book of Daniel, it starts with a king by the name of Nebuchadnezzar, who he comes, if you read the book of Chronicles, or Second Chronicles, Second Kings, the books of Daniel, and then Ezra and Nehemiah. Those are the books some of the books that pertain to the Babylonian captivity. What happens is there's a king by the name of Nebuchadnezzar, who's the king of Babylon. And that's this guy here, Nebuchadnezzar II. And he comes along and he begins to take captives of the Jewish nation. There's actually 4 waves that he comes in to take captives. The first time he comes in, it's about his first year as king, or shortly before his first year as king. And he takes Daniel, among others, captive, and Daniel is the author of the book of Daniel, who is basically writing during his time as a captive under the Babylonians and then later the Medo-Persians, who take over the Babylonian Empire. So under the chronology that most people understand, or through the history books, Nebuchadnezzar's first year is roughly 604 BC. So according to the history books, 604 BC would be the year that he took Daniel and some of his associates, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, captive. Okay. Then what happens is Nebuchadnezzar comes back in his 8th year, and he performs another siege, on Jerusalem and takes away some more captives. And then again in his 19th year, one of his commanders, Nebuzaradan, comes and they basically take a ton of captives. They lay siege around the city and they burn down the temple. And that's kind of the major captivity out of all the four. That happens about the 18th or 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. So under that chronology, under the history books, the way we have it right now, that chronology is roughly around 586 BC, give or take, is where the time that most people reading the history books believe that the first Jewish temple, or Solomon's temple, because Solomon built it, was burnt down. That's wrong, and I'll show you why in a second. So anyways, but they believe it's 586 BC. Now, that supposedly starts the 7 years of captivity, or some point in there. Maybe it goes back to Daniel. There's some interpretation as to which of those four captivities actually started these 70 years of Babylonian captivity. I'll get into that in a little bit. But the captivity, the taking away of the captives, the third taking away of the captives that happened around the 18th or 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, that wasn't the last one. The last one that happened in the 23rd year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, when one of his generals, Nebuzaradan, came and took away the last group of captives. So those are the four episodes where the Babylonians came and they captured the Israels and took away into captivity. First one, they took away Daniel. They came again in the 8th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, again around the 18th or 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and that's when they burned down the temple, and then again around the 23rd year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. So those are the four captivities. Again, the first year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, according to history books, 604 BC. The temple supposedly was burned down in 586 BC, around the 18th or 19th year of his reign. So that's how the ancient nation of Israel went into the Babylonian captivity. Which, if you've studied the book of Daniel, if you've studied the Babylonian captivity, you're probably familiar with that and those dates. Now, according to the Bible, the ancient Jewish nation was allowed to go home under the King Cyrus after the Persians took over the Babylonian Empire, and that they date as 539 BC. So if you can see we kind of have a bit of a problem here already, because the first year of Cyrus, which is supposedly the day that the year that the captives were set free, if it's 539 BC according to the history books, if you add 70 years to that date, you come up to 609 BC. So you're already 5 years beyond Nebuchadnezzar's the start of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and Nebuchadnezzar's captivity didn't start until the first year of his reign. So 609 BC to 539 BC doesn't really cut it. So there's a lot of debate about, oh, maybe the years are off a little bit, maybe where do we start and end the captivity and so forth. The reason why this all doesn't match up, and people keep arguing about this over the years, is because all of this here is wrong, and I'll show you why this is all wrong. And that's that they're trying to put a square peg into a round hole, and it doesn't work, and I'll show you why. So anyways, these are kings, Babylonian kings here. We have Nebuchadnezzar, who was Nebuchadnezzar's father, and then after him comes a king named Marduk, who serves just a couple years, and then Nergal-Sharezer, who also serves only a few years, and then Labashi-Marduk, a very short time, less than a year, and then Nabonidus, who serves about 17 years or so, and he's the one that Cyrus, according to the articles we find in history, certain tablets and so forth, such as the Nabonidus Chronicles, he's the one that the historical archaeological evidence suggests that Cyrus ended up defeating and taking over the Babylonian Empire. So that's the way the history books depict it. Now, how do they come up with these particular dates in history? How do they anchor them? Well, one of the main reasons that they anchor these dates in history is because of a particular tablet, an astronomical tablet, that recorded the planets in the skies that we found, and we were able to take a look at those positions of those planets and determine when they happened in history. And that astronomical tablet is listed as the 37th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. And we know where that particular astronomical recording listed on those tablets could only have happened in a certain specific year in history. So because of that, we're able to peg Nebuchadnezzar's reign to that 37th year and get all the rest of these dates. Okay, and I'll show you that tablet here, just the information on just 1 second. Okay, it's kind of hard to see, but this is the tablet here. Okay, it's called VAT 4956. Okay, and VAT 4956 is an archaeological tablet that was found in the desert, or in the Middle East, maybe not necessarily the desert, but basically what it is, it's an astronomical recording of the different positions of the planets in the sky, and the tablet is listed as occurring in the 37th year of of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. And here's the text of the tablet. Year 37 of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, month 1, which is the 30th of the preceding month, the moon became visible behind the bowl of heaven. The bowl of heaven is the constellation Taurus, the bowl, and so forth. So the moon became, it goes on basically line by line here to show positions of planets in certain constellations. And we know from that the only possible date for all these conjunction of planets and so forth is 568 BC. So if it's dated to the 37th year of Nebuchadnezzar, and this tablet could only have been written for 568 BC, then that tells us where all the rest of the years of Nebuchadnezzar's reign line up, and therefore we can also know where all the kings that come before and after him, where those years are, and so forth. Okay, so this is a very, very important tablet, a very key tablet in dating the reigns of the Babylonian kings, VAT 4956. So here's the problem. This is what they don't tell you. This particular tablet is not original to the Babylonian era. It is a copy that was done a couple hundred years later by some other scribes, and so we don't have the original tablet. So for all we know, they may have put in the 37th year of Nebuchadnezzar, thinking that was the king at the time, but we don't know for sure if the original tablet says that. It could have been the 37th year of some other king. It could have been maybe not the 37th year at all if they messed up on their scribe work. We just assume that this is correct because it says it's correct. I'm going to make the contention that they made a mistake when they copied this tablet, or that they recorded the wrong name for the king Nebuchadnezzar, or that they're using the king Nebuchadnezzar as more of a blanket term, the way you'd use Caesar. And let me explain that. The word Caesar is obviously the name of the head of the Roman Empire in ancient times. The name Caesar was actually a family name, like you have a surname or a last name, for Julius Caesar. Okay. But once, so just like you might have, John Doe, and Doe being the last name, it was his family name. That's where the name Caesar came from. However, when he became basically dictator, the power of that name in that time became very important. So people began to adopt, the later successors to him began to adopt that name as a title, because if you take on that person's name, you can use that the what do you call it, the renownness, if that's a word, of that name to rule and reign in a given kingdom. So for example, if everyone's afraid of Caesar, and someone comes along and says, "Hey, pay taxes," or Caesar's going to send troops here, you would pay taxes because you know who Caesar is and you're afraid of him. If you're an illiterate, villager or peasant, and everyone's heard about Caesar, you don't read and write back in those days for the most part, but you know who Caesar is, and if you're worried about not having an army marching down your main street, you pay your taxes to Caesar. But if someone comes along and says, "Hey, Joe Nobody says pay taxes to him," well, who's Joe Nobody? Okay, so there's a lot of importance in a name. So when you had a successor that would take over a kingdom, they would take on the name of the their forebears, because that name had a certain amount of value. And those throne names, we call them throne names, that's still practiced even in this day and age. We do it a little bit more symbolically, but they still take on throne names. So for example, with popes, when a pope becomes a new pope, he will take on a name. It might be a name of an earlier apostle, Paul or John or something like that. When a king takes over, like King George III, okay, they take on a throne name because there is a certain value to taking on a throne name historically. Now, in our day and age, it doesn't mean like as much as it did back then, but back in the day, a name meant a lot. A name was the marketing, was the PR, was your ability to rule because people feared and respected a certain name. So that's what happened with Caesar. So it's possible that when they're referring to Nebuchadnezzar here, it doesn't necessarily mean the Nebuchadnezzar of Nebuchadnezzar II. It could just mean Nebuchadnezzar being the king of Babylon as a sort of a title. Just in the same way you would refer to Caesar, the head of Rome. It doesn't necessarily mean it's Julius Caesar. It could be another Caesar. See what I'm saying? So, and there's certain evidence that in history that's the throne name that could have been taken on for other kings. Because, as I mentioned earlier, the Nebuchadnezzar we're referring to here is Nebuchadnezzar II, meaning there was an earlier Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar I, that established that particular throne name. So really, anybody before and after that first Nebuchadnezzar could assume that throne name. There might be a second name added to it, or they might refer to them differently, but they might still also inherit that title amongst other titles. And that they could be referred to historically in documents, which make things very confusing if that's the case, but it is quite possible. And again, also, like I said, it is quite possible that the scribe, when they recorded that particular tablet, they could have it wrong. I'm going to show you why it definitely is wrong here. And if you look at the Bible, there's no other possibility. So let me get into the chronology here and show you why this chronology cannot have happened. But firstly, I got to go through this real quick here. So you have the Babylonian kings: Nabopolassar, Nebuchadnezzar, Amel-Marduk, Nergal-Sharezer, Labashi-Marduk, Nabonidus, and then the Persians take over. And this is called the Achaemenid Empire. Cyrus the Persian, was Cyrus the Great, who's Cyrus II. His son Cambyses. And then you have Smerdis, Darius the First, or Darius the Great, his son Xerxes. If you've seen the 300 movies, This is Sparta, that kind of thing. This is the guy here that they're referring to, Xerxes, versus Leonidas. Then you've got his son Artaxerxes. You've got Xerxes II, Sogdianus, and Darius Nelthus, or Darius II. These three basically battle out for the throne around 423 BC. Darius ends up winning. And he becomes the head of the Achaemenid Empire, and then underneath him, Artaxerxes II, Artaxerxes III, Artaxerxes IV, Darius III, and Darius III is defeated by a guy by the name of Alexander the Great. So that is the Medo-Persian era, the Medo-Persian Empire. Now, these dates, for the most part, are pretty correct. And the reason why they're correct all the way up to Xerxes is because, if you remember what I was saying earlier, this is when you start to get into the battles, like Xerxes versus the Greeks and Leonidas, the movies 300 and so forth. Once you get into the era of Xerxes and on down the line, now you start to get into the Greek historical record, because they begin fighting each other, and those events begin to get recorded in history by the Greeks. Most what we know about the Persians we get from Greek historical records. And unfortunately, because the Greeks are the enemy of the Persians, a lot of those historical records don't have a very good opinion of the Medo-Persian Empire. But the point being is that because now we get into the Greek historical record, it's a lot easier for us to historically confirm these dates. Once you get before that time, before those battles begin to take place with Xerxes and so forth, those dates can become a lot more questionable. And so the Babylonian record, the early part of the Achaemenid record and the Medo-Persian Empire, that becomes a little bit more tougher to nail down, and history becomes a little bit more cloudier. And so we have to kind of piece together little tablets that we find in the desert and information like that in order to kind of jigsaw puzzle who reigned for how many years and when and so forth. It's not like when we get into the Greek area where it becomes a little bit more easier, which again starts around the reign of Xerxes I. So from here on down, these dates, the history books do pretty well. Once you get beyond that and beyond the Greek records, now the history books start to mess up, and that's where all the rest of the stuff gets wrong, and I'll show you why it's wrong in a second. So anyways, first let's start with the correct chronology. So one moment. Okay, in order to put together the correct chronology, we have to kind of count backwards from events in history. First of all, the major event I'm going to be counting backwards from is the Jewish revolt, which ended up with the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD. Now, our best historian for that is a guy by the name of Josephus. And Josephus, in his writings, lists that the reason for that revolt that started the war between the Romans and the Jews, that ended up culminated with the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, the reason above all others, according to Josephus, was because of the coming foretold prophecy that the Messiah would appear about that time. And this is what Josephus says back in those days. He wrote, but what more than all these incited them to the war was an ambiguous oracle or prophet, also found in their sacred writings that, and this is what the prophet was saying, that about that time one from their country would become ruler of the habitable world. In other words, the Messiah would come about that time. This they took to mean that one of their own people and many of the wise. This they took to mean one of their own people would be the Messiah, basically, and that many of the wise men were misled in their interpretation. This oracle, however, in reality signified the government of Vespasian, who was proclaimed to be emperor while in Judea. Now, of course, Josephus was not a Christian, and so his interpretation is that that particular oracle or prophecy was speaking about Vespasian, who would basically end up becoming emperor of the Roman Empire. However, if we go back and look at what possible prophet or what possible sacred writing or oracle out of the sacred writings of Jewish scriptures he could be referring to, in my opinion, the only prophet in the sacred writings that could possibly stand out that predicted the Messiah coming about that time has to be from the book of Daniel. That's the only prophet that predicted the Messiah around the time of the destruction of the ancient Jewish temple. In all the sacred writings, the Tanakh and the literature, the religious literature that we have handed down to us for Judaism in history, there's no other prophet in the Bible or in the scriptures that puts a time on the appearance of the Messiah like Daniel does. And the most important prophecy that people who study the book of Daniel know about the timing of the coming of the Messiah is a prophecy called the prophecy of the 70 weeks, which occurs in the 9th chapter of the book of Daniel. So let's go there and take a look at that, because I believe that is the oracle that Josephus is referring to here. That's the prophet who predicted that the Messiah would come in that time. So let's take a look at the book of Daniel and see what it says in chapter 9 about that particular prophecy. So in Daniel chapter 9:1, it says that in the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, which is the Hebrew version for the name Xerxes, okay, in the first year of Darius, son of Xerxes, basically, of the seed of the Medes, which was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans, who were the Babylonians. In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by books the number of years whereupon the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem. He's talking about the 70-year captivity. So what happens at this point is Daniel begins to pray a prayer of repentance about the fact that the temple's been desolate this whole time, and why the prophecy of Jeremiah hasn't come to fruition, where they would be able to return home after 70 years yet and repair the temple. So Daniel's praying during all these verses here and repenting for the fact that they've sinned, and that this calamity has come upon them, that they're in the 70-year captivity, and all the curses in the Old Testament are coming to fruition upon his people and his generation. Then we get down to verse 9:20. It says, and Daniel says, and while I was speaking and praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my supplications before the Lord my God for the holy mountain of my God, that is Mount Zion, or the location of the temple in Jerusalem, which was where the temple was desolate at this time, he says, while I was speaking in prayer, even that man Gabriel, and Gabriel's an angel, even while that man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the beginning, being caused to fly swiftly, touched me about the time of the evening oblation, okay, or the evening sacrifice, if you will. And he informed me and talked with me and said, O Daniel, I am now come forth to give thee skill and understanding. At the beginning of thy supplications, the commandment came forth. What commandment? The commandment to rebuild the temple. Okay, so the very beginning of Daniel's prayer of repentance that he started at that line, verse 1 in the chapter, that's when the commandment came forth, and the angel Gabriel shows up to tell him that. At the beginning of thy supplications, thy commandment came forth, and I am come to show thee that thou art greatly beloved. Therefore, understand the matter and consider the vision. Okay, and now this is the prophecy that I believe Josephus is referring to, because this is the prophecy that tells when the Messiah is going to come and about the time that he would appear. And he says, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up the vision and the prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Okay. Know therefore and understand. Okay, now first of all, I have to stop here for a second. The 70 weeks that he's talking about are 70 weeks of years, because in the Hebrew tradition, and this is in the book of Leviticus, the reason that they're cited for having gone into the Babylonian captivity is because they weren't keeping sabbatical years, which is you have 6 years where you work and you plow the fields and you grow crops, and in the 7th year you're supposed to let the fields rest as a form of crop rotation. And they weren't practicing this. In the book of Chronicles, it states that that was the primary reason they were going into the captivity under Nebuchadnezzar. So what happens was 70 years is supposed to go by where they were taken out of the land into Babylon for captivity. The land would be allowed to rest for 70 years to make up for all the sabbatical years that they missed, and then they would be allowed to return back to the land again and rebuild the temple. So the 70 weeks that they're talking about, or the 77s, are 70 sevens of years, making up for those each of those years that they missed their sabbatical year throughout the history of the first temple. Okay, so 77s are determined upon thy people in thy holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make a reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, seal up the vision, the prophecy, and anoint the most holy. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. Now, when did the commandment came forth? It came forth at the beginning of Daniel's prayer in verse 1 of this chapter. Okay, and Gabriel said that's when the commandment came forth. So he says, know therefore and understand, from the going forth of the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem unto Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks. Okay, again, these are weeks of years, and 62 weeks, and the street shall be built again, and the wall even in troubled times. So we have a period of 7 sevens, which is 49 years, and 62 years, which is 434 years. We add those together, we get a total of 483 years. Okay, and it says the streets shall be built again, and the wall even troubled times. After 62 weeks, shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself, and the people of the prince that shall come shall do what? Destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end wars and desolations are determined. So he's saying they're going to be able to go back and rebuild their temple, but after the end of after these weeks of years have passed by, that temple is going to be destroyed again, and the city, and there's going to be wars all the way till the end, until the desolations are determined again. So their first temple was destroyed. This prophecy is saying, guess what? The temple you're going to rebuild, that's going to be destroyed too, at the culmination of this prophecy. Okay, and it says, and he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week. Okay, that's the last week of this 70 weeks prophecy. And in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even unto the consummation, and that determined shall be poured out upon the desolate. Okay, so that the temple again is going to be desolate once again. Okay, so what we have a 49-year period, we have a 434-year period, and we have a 7-year period, because we have 7 weeks, 62 weeks, and then a final week listed in here in Daniel 9:27. When you add all those up, that's your 70 weeks, or 490 years, because it's 70 sets of 7 years. So what does that mean? Well, it means this prophecy, okay, was saying that the Messiah would come and the temple would be destroyed at the end of a period of about 490 years. All right. Well, if Josephus is writing around the time, going back to our original line from Josephus here, where he says the chief cause of the war, the chief inducement of the war, was an equivocal oracle or prophet, also found in their sacred writings, that announced that at this time a man from their country, that's the Messiah, would be a ruler of the world. Okay, so Daniel spoke when the Messiah was going to come in his prophecy of the weeks, but he also said the temple was going to be destroyed about that time. All right. Josephus is writing around the time of the Jewish revolt when that second temple was destroyed, which was in 70 AD. So therefore, in order for Daniel's prophecy to be true, and I believe Daniel is the oracle that Josephus is, or the prophet that Josephus is referring to in the sacred writings of the Hebrews, in order for that prophet to be true, that the temple is destroyed at the end of this 490-year period, that would mean that whenever Daniel is writing, it has to be approximately 490 years before the destruction of the second temple. Because if it's not, then Daniel's prophecy did not come true. And it also means that the the Messianic era has to be roughly around that time as well. So what had happened was, when Josephus is saying, but the chief cause of the war was this oracle, that one of their own leaders would become the ruler of the world, what he's talking about here is the people in that time, he's saying, that one of the main causes that the Jews revolted at that time was because they had this prophecy that the Messiah was supposed to show up in their day, and so therefore they were beginning to rise up in this messianic revolt because they believed they were going to be able to throw off the Romans, and one of their own would be the Messiah, who would then basically rule the world. Okay, so they saw this messianic movement as a way to throw off their Roman oppressors, and that's what started the war. This was the number one cause, according to Josephus. And the reason why they believe that is because they had the prophecies from the book of Daniel saying that the Messiah would show up roughly in their generation. Okay? And so you had a whole bunch of people that were popping up claiming to be the Messiah. Jesus warned about all this. He said that not one stone will be left upon another on the temple, and he said that many would basically rise up and say they're Messiah and lead many astray and so forth. So he knew all this was coming because Jesus also knew about the prophecies in the book of Daniel, and he also warned about the abomination of desolation, that they should look for that, and that those in Judea should flee into the mountains. So Jesus knew this was all coming because he's reading the book of Daniel. Now Jesus is the Messiah, okay? But they didn't recognize him as the Messiah. He was coming in that generation, but they rejected him, and they cut him off, basically. They killed him on the cross, but then he rose again. But he is the ultimate Messiah, okay? So I'm going to show you how that works within the prophecy of Daniel and the timeline and everything else, and why that has to be. But first I want to get back to the chronology part of this, so you can kind of understand that the only way for Daniel to work is that you have to count back about 490 years roughly from the destruction of the second temple, and that gives you the time frame when Daniel is writing his prophecy, because otherwise Daniel's prophecy didn't come true. Now here's where most people try to make this work, because getting back to our original chronology, if we look at the history books, okay, most history books will say that the Babylonian captivity, Daniel was taken into captivity around 605, 604 BC. So if Daniel is writing at the end of the 70 years, then that means that Daniel's 70 weeks had to happen around, well, let's see, 605. That would be about 535 BC, roughly. And Darius, according to the history books, took over the Babylonian captivity, Babylonian Empire around 539 BC. So Daniel supposedly, if you believe the history books, had to be writing his 70 weeks prophecy in the 530s of BC. Okay, well, if he's writing his prophecy in the 530s of BC, and his prophecy says that the Messiah is going to show up in 490 years and the temple is going to be destroyed in 490 years, we got a problem, because Daniel's prophecy would culminate or have to come to fruition roughly, well, let's see, if it's 490 years from 530, let's do the math here real quick. Let's say, okay, according to this, let's say Daniel was taken captivity in 605 BC, all right? So 605, let's subtract 70 years from that point, okay? So that would be 535 BC, and then Daniel's prophecy is supposed to last about 490 years, according to chapter 9. So that would bring it to about 45 years before Christ. And we know that the temple wasn't destroyed till 70 years after Christ, which would make Daniel's prophecy about 105 years off, and it wouldn't work. You'd have to adjust the numbers quite a bit in order to get that to work at all. And that's where people do these mental gymnastics, and they try to say, oh, well, there are prophetic years where there's 360 days in a year and all this kind of stuff. The problem is that the history books are wrong, and they're trying to fit the Bible to the history books rather than making the history books fit the Bible. And when you make the history books fit the Bible, all of a sudden all the historical record becomes very clear, and you see where the non-Christian history, the people that wrote the history books, where they screwed up, and how the real evidence, the real archaeological evidence, supports the Bible's chronology and not what we put together as what we think the chronology of history is. So, and I'll show you how that works here in a second. So let's go back to the book of, or let's go to the list of the kings again of the Achaemenid Empire, and find out when that 490 years should have started. Okay, if Daniel's prophecy culminates with the destruction of the Second Temple, and the Second Temple, and that had to occur according to Daniel's prophecies about 490 years after the prophecy was given, all we got to do is subtract 490 years back from when the temple was destroyed in 70 A.D., and that brings us to roughly around the year 421 BC. Now, I say 421 because there's no year 0. Now, there's a little bit of a fudge factor there because the year for in ancient times did not start on December 31st, January 1st and December 31st, so forth. The new year started in the spring. So you can actually have a little bit of a lapse over there. So you may, for mathematical purposes, you could actually count back from 69 AD from the destruction of the temple, or the start of the siege, because the siege actually started in the 69th year, not the 70th year, because the year didn't flip over till the spring, if that makes sense. So even though the siege against Jerusalem started in 70 AD, it was still before the new year yet. So it still goes back to, you would count from the 69 AD year. So anyways, and then the same thing at the other end. 421 could easily be a little bit of 422 or 423 or thereabouts, depending on how much we have to adjust the historical record. But the point being is roughly 490 years from the destruction of the temple is the time frame that we're looking for. Okay, that's when Daniel has to be writing. And if that's the case, then there's no way Daniel could have been taken in captivity in 604, 605 BC, because if he's writing in 420 BC or 422 or thereabouts, that's way too long for Daniel to have lived, and plus the 70-year captivity would have been a lot longer than 70 years. So either Daniel's prophecy is wrong or her historical record is wrong. One of those two. And I'll show you why the historical record is wrong and Daniel's prophecy held true. Okay. Daniel's prophecy of the 70 weeks, if we go back to the start of chapter 9, when he starts the prophecy, he says, in the first year of Darius, son of Ahasuerus or Xerxes. Okay, that's when he's writing this. In the first year of his reign, he's speaking here. When the angel Gabriel comes to meet him after he's repenting here, he says, he tells Daniel, while I was speaking and praying, okay, confessing my sin, the sins of the people, and presenting the supplications of the Lord my God in the holy mountain of my God, yea, while speaking prayer, even the man Gabriel, who I had seen in the vision in the beginning, caused to fly swift, touched me about the time of the evening oblation, informed me, and talked with me, and said, Daniel, now I am come to give thee skill and understanding. And at the beginning of thy supplications, now when's the beginning of his supplications? In the first year of Darius. Okay, that's what he just got done saying, son of Ahasuerus, son of Xerxes. Okay, at the beginning of thy supplications, the commandment came forth. Okay, that's the commandment to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, etc. So it didn't happen, the commandment didn't come under Artaxerxes' decree, and they try to find all these different decrees in history where it might have been, it could have been Cyrus's decree, could have been Artaxerxes' decree, could have been, one of these other decrees, that's when the commandment came forth. No. Gabriel says the commandment comes forth at the beginning of thy supplications, which Daniel just said. He was giving his supplications in the first year of Darius, son of Ahasuerus. So we know when this timeline starts. It starts in the first year of Darius, son of Ahasuerus, son of Xerxes. Okay? So then he goes on to say the 70 weeks are determined upon thy people, and upon thy holy mountain to finish the transgression, and so forth. He says, know therefore and understand from the going forth of the commandment. What commandment is he talking about? The commandment that came forth at the beginning of thy supplications, the commandment that came forth. This is all the same subject here. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and rebuild Jerusalem unto Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks, 62 weeks shall it be built again, and the wall even in troubled times. So the commandment to restore and rebuild Jerusalem comes forth, and when? In the first year of Darius, son of Xerxes. Okay, that's when the 490 years has to start. The first year of Darius, son of Ahasuerus, or Xerxes. Okay, so if we know when the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, and we count back about 490 years, that'll tell us who this Darius, son of Ahasuerus, or son of Xerxes is. It should anyway. So let's go look at our historical record. Okay, now remember what I said. Xerxes the first, or Xerxes the Great, is the last king where the historical record is actually correct. Before that, we get out of the Greek era and we don't have very good records. But from Xerxes on down, we get good records, so we know the reigns of these kings. Okay, so if we go around the time of 421, 422 BC, thereabouts, which is 490 years before the destruction of the first temple, we see a guy starts to reign by the name of Darius II. Okay, 423 would be his accession year. 422 BC to 421 BC would be his first year of his reign. Matches up perfectly with the book of Daniel. 422, 421 BC is when Daniel is giving this 70-week prophecy, and it's 490 years before the destruction of the temple. Well, what does that mean? If that's the case, then the 70-year captivity has to end about this time. So you add another 70 years, and that's roughly the time of the Babylonian captivity. It has to be during the 400s BC. So if you begin to adjust the historical record, or take a look at the historical record and apply it to the Bible, when you begin to look at all the archaeological evidence, you can see that they piece together their understanding of the chronology of the early Medo-Persian Achaemenid Empire and the Babylonian Empire. They put it together wrong, the historians did. That once you apply the historical record to the Bible, or the archaeological evidence, not the way they interpret it, you will quickly see that no, the correct time frame for the rule of these kings and so forth perfectly matches up with having the Babylonian captivity in the 400s BC, not the 6 to 500s BC. Okay, which changes everything, but more importantly, it confirms the prophecy of the book of Daniel. Okay, Darius II is the Darius that is being talked about in the book of Daniel, and also it all of a sudden the book of Daniel sequentially, chronologically makes sense too, when you understand that it's Darius II that he's talking about. So what else does that mean? Well, in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, when they go back to rebuild the temple and so forth, it's the second year of Darius that they begin building the temple again. Okay, so they start rebuilding the temple again in the second year of Darius, which is Darius II. After those days, the Bible says, after all those things, then Ezra comes along around the 6th and 7th year of Artaxerxes, okay, who's Artaxerxes II, and then in the 20th year of Artaxerxes II comes along Nehemiah, and Nehemiah begins to spend 12 years rebuilding the walls in Jerusalem and so forth, and finishes up with building the gates and so forth in the last year. So that is this is the correct time period for the rebuilding of the temple. Okay, not Artaxerxes up here. It's Artaxerxes II. That's one of the other areas that they're messing up. So they start trying to count to the Messiah from Artaxerxes here, but the problem is that the culmination of Daniel's prophecy ends with the destruction of the Second Temple. And if you start counting from this Artaxerxes, it doesn't take us to 70 AD. Okay, so it has to be, everything has to be Darius II and Artaxerxes II. I'm going to give you another confirmation why it has to be Darius II. Let's go back to the book of Daniel here. We're going to go to chapter 10 here. Okay, and it says, in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a thing was revealed unto Daniel, whose name is Belshazzar. Okay, now I'm going to skip ahead here. So Daniel's talking in the 3rd year. All right, he's talking to the angel of Gabriel, but when you get to the next chapter, the conversation continues, and Gabriel is, now remember, he's talking in the 3rd year of Cyrus right now. Gabriel says, also I, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood to confirm and strengthen him. Okay, so Gabriel is talking in the third year of Cyrus, but he's talking about Darius, a Darius that came before the third year of Cyrus. Okay, had to, because that's when Gabriel's speaking. He's speaking in the third year of Cyrus. So it says also in the first year of Darius the Mede. So whoever this Darius the Mede is, he came before the third year of Cyrus. Otherwise, Gabriel wouldn't be able to be talking about him right now. Okay. So anyways, and he goes on to say, and I will show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the fourth shall be far richer than they all, and by his strength and through his great riches he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia, or Greece. And a mighty king shall stand up and rule with a great dominion, and do according to his will. And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken, and it shall be divided towards the 4 winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, or according to his dominion, which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up, even for others besides those. Okay, so there's going to be 3 more kings in Persia, and a fourth will be far richer than they all, and he's going to go to war with Greece. And then a guy from Greece is going to stand up and basically take over, but he's going to die young, and his kingdom's going to be divided, not to his own kin, not to his own heir, but between others, between the 4 winds of heaven. Okay. The Greek person that they're talking about here, who stands up, is Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great died young. He took over the Medo-Persian Empire, and then his kingdom was divided between 4 of his generals, not to his own heir or his own posterity. So let's go back to now, because we're getting into the Greek record, so we can look at the history of the kings for the Greek record. Okay, Alexander the Great, he's took over the Medo-Persian Empire around 330 BC. All right, he took it over from a guy by the name of Darius III. All right, so now remember now, Daniel's prophecy started in Darius II. Okay. Then he's speaking in the third year of a Cyrus that had to have come after a Darius. Okay, the only Cyruses that we have in the historical record, okay, is we have Cyrus II, Cyrus I, which is a lot earlier in history. So you got Cyrus I, which is earlier in history, but the Babylonians are ruling at that time, at the time of Cyrus I. Cyrus II, who supposedly allowed the Jews to return from captivity. And then there's one other Cyrus in history, okay, and that is, when we get back to Darius II, his son's name was Cyrus, Cyrus the Younger, okay, and that particular Cyrus, when Darius died, there was a battle about 3 years after Darius dies, where Artaxerxes and that Cyrus are vying for the throne. Now Artaxerxes won out, but they were both claiming to be king, okay, so the only Cyrus that comes after a Darius in this list is Cyrus II. Now there is a possibility, and I'm going to show you, that Cyrus the Great and Darius the Great were somewhat co-regents. So there is maybe a possibility that could be referring to that, but I disagree for this reason. If we go back to Daniel chapter 11, and it says, and I will show you the truth, behold, there shall yet stand up 3 kings in Persia, and the 4 shall be far richer than they all. So there's only 3 or 4 kings after the time that Gabriel's speaking before Alexander the Great stands up. So let's go back to our historical record here, and let's count. If Alexander, or if we're speaking in the time of Cyrus after Darius II, how many Persian kings are left to stand up in Persia? 1, 2, 3, and then the 4th will be far richer than them all, Darius II. And then from there, Alexander the Great takes over, and his kingdom's divided between his 4 generals. Matches up perfectly again with this all taking place around the time of Darius II and his son Cyrus the Younger. There's no way it could be taking around the time of Darius I. There's too many kings here. Again, the prophecy would fail. So we know when the Babylonian captivity has to occur. All right. The other problem is that sequentially the book of Daniel doesn't make sense unless you look at it from the standpoint of the captivity ending in the reign of Darius II. And I'll show you why here in a second. First, I'm going to bring up, this is the chronology that I actually developed after piecing together the Bible. And I'll show you the answers to some of those questions, like the VAT 37 tablet that we mentioned earlier. So these are the years here. So like this would be the year 421 AD. Let me go real quickly here. We're going to get into the captivity, the reigns of Artaxerxes, and so forth. So first, let's start with. Let me go forward in history here. Okay. 70 AD, the temple is destroyed. Around 66 AD is when the Jewish revolt starts. In the year 74, and there's some argument whether it's year 73 or year 74 in the spring. Roughly, it's still about 73 because of the timing of this. Because again, the year doesn't flip over to the spring in ancient times. But Masada, when the last portion of the Jewish revolt ended, I believe was in 74 AD. I believe the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, and I believe the revolt started around 66 AD. Okay. So a few years before that time, the temple is completed. What do I mean by the temple completed? Okay, what happened was when the Jews returned from captivity, in my opinion, around the 420s BC, they rebuilt their temple again. But later on, about 20 or so years before Christ, a little less than that, a guy by the name of Herod decides that he's going to tear down that second temple, and he's going to rebuild a grandiose, very luxurious temple to replace it, because he's basically going to upgrade the temple in his opinion. So what he does is, because they had to carry on the sacrifices and the worship during that time, he agrees to build it around and over the old temple, and then when it's completed, then he would tear down the old temple inside, and then the new temple will basically take over. So that was Herod's plan. So Herod starts that about 20 years before Christ. And he does not complete that work, or his work is not finally completed until the 60s AD. And Josephus mentions that that was also one of the causes of the revolt, because what happened was all the workers, and this is according to Josephus, all the workers that were working on the temple suddenly, when it's completed, found themselves unemployed. Well, what happens when you've got a bunch of unemployed people? You could have riots on your hand because there's no money, no jobs, etc. And so it helped give fuel to the revolt against the Romans. So that was one of the major causes for the Jewish revolt, according to Josephus. So anyways, getting back to this now. If we go backwards in history, here's the years. So we're going 60s, 50s, 40s. This is the time of the crucifixion of Christ, 33, 34 AD, somewhere in there. Okay, so we're going to go back to the birth of Christ, which is around the year 1 BC, 1 AD. Okay, I'm going to show you something very important about this particular point in time. When Daniel got his prophecy in chapter 9, okay, it said that 77s were determined on thy people and thy holy mountain to finish the transgression. So hold on one second here. Let me go back to Daniel chapter 9, and we'll talk about this prophecy here again real quick. In the first year of Darius, son of Ahasuerus, of the seed of the Medes, so we know that's Darius II that we're talking about, right? So when Gabriel begins to speak this prophecy of the 70 weeks, and he says, which is 70 weeks a year, so which is 490 years, he says 70 weeks or 490 years are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make a reconciliation for iniquity, and to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up the vision and the prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Okay. So if we look at the Messianic era, the earliest possible point for this prophecy, for the Messianic era, would be basically from 70 weeks at the start of this finishing of the transgression, if you will. Okay, so 70 weeks are determined by people to finish the transgression. Okay, so they were taken into captivity. Okay, in would have been about 70 years roughly before, or the temple could be destroyed roughly 70 years before Gabriel's speaking here. Okay, that would have been the start of the Babylonian captivity. So the earliest time we could really enter into the Messianic era, according to this prophecy, would have been around 490 BC, where we'd start counting the clock. Okay, Now, obviously, that's not the same as the destruction of the temple, but we're talking now about not the destruction of the temple. We're talking about the coming of the Messiah. The Messiah has to be born, he has to live, and then he has to eventually get to a point in his life where he can assume the kingship. Okay, so if the temple is going to be destroyed in 70 A.D., we know that many years before that, at some point in time, the Messiah has to be born. Okay, so the earliest time that they can begin looking for the birth of the Messiah would have to be from about 490 BC. If all this is going to play out by at least 70 AD, if you have 70 years and you want to start counting not from the destruction of the temple, but from the birth of the Messiah, that has to come at the earliest date around 490s BC. All right. So because of that, they would have known when to look for the birth of the Messiah based on this prophecy. The wise men and the magi, of which Daniel was the head. Okay. So, and there's another prophecy that they're going to look for as well to give a signal about the coming of the Messiah and the birth of the Messiah, and that's an Old Testament prophecy. Oops, and that's a prophecy given by a guy by the name of Balaam. Let's see, hang on a second here, and it says that a star shall come out of Jacob. So hold on a second. So in the book of Numbers, Balaam gives this prophecy. It says, I see him now, I see him, he's talking about the Messiah here. I shall see him, but not now. I shall behold him, but not near. There shall come a star out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. And he shall smite the corners of Moab and destroy all the children of Sheth. Okay, so there's this prophecy, a messianic prophecy, about a star arising out of Jacob. Okay, so if they're going to look for the birth time of the Messiah, not the time that he actually becomes the king and rules and reigns and so forth, because that would have to happen later in the prophecy of the 70 weeks. If they want to look for the birth time of the prophecy, the earliest possible time they can really start, because they have to count from the beginning of the start of the captivity, if you will. They have to go from maybe about 490 BC and count 490 years. That's the earliest time that they can look for the birth of the Messiah. And what's the sign that they're going to see the coming of the Messiah? They're going to see a star rising out of Jacob. Okay, so if we go to the New Testament, we're looking for the Star of Bethlehem. Now, if we read about the Star of Bethlehem here, hold on one second. Okay, here's Matthew chapter 2, talking about the Star of Bethlehem. Now, the wise men that came from the east, Daniel was the head of the wise men in Babylon, in the kingdom of Babylon. So about 490 years after the start of the Babylonian captivity, we have the wise men in the east see the star in the heavens, and they're going to describe the events here. Now, it starts in Matthew chapter 2, verse 1. Now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, Where's the king that was born king of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and we've come to worship him. And so they said where he was born, so they know that when they're looking for is the birth, not when he's actually going to become king. And Herod goes on to say, and when Herod heard the king had heard these things, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes and all the people together, he demanded of them where Christ, which is a name for the Messiah, that's the Greek word for Messiah, demanded where Christ should be born, or where the Messiah should be born. So they're looking for the Messiah. They know that the star, the prophecy of the star, is occurring according to the wise men, and that the Messiah is about to come. Okay. So then Matthew 2:5 says, And they said unto him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet, And thou, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the princes of Judah, for out of thee shall come a governor that shall rule my people Israel. Again, remember the oracle, the messianic prophecy that Josephus was referring to, that about that time one of their own people would become ruler of the inhabitable world? This is the whole messianic era. Because of those prophecies, they knew that this was the time that the Messiah had to appear. Or either he had to appear during that time, and it had to be the Messiah, or the prophecies of the Old Testament failed. Those are the only two possibilities here. So obviously Jesus is the Messiah. He's the only person from that era who fits or fulfills those. There's no one else from that time in history that they possibly could fulfill the scriptures except for Jesus Christ. Jesus is the Messiah. Okay. So anyways, Going on in verse 2:7 here, it says, Then Herod, when they had privately called the wise men, inquired of them diligently what time the star appeared. Okay, so he's saying, when did you see the star? About the star that's going to foretell the birth of the Messiah. All right, and he says, and he sent to Bethlehem and said, Go and search diligently for the young child, and when you have found him, bring me word again that I may come and worship him also. And it says in verse 9, when they had heard the king, they departed, and lo, they saw the star which they saw in the east went before them, till it come and stood over where the child was. So they saw the star a first time, okay? And that's what sent them from Babylonia, or wherever they were coming in the east, to go to Jerusalem, okay? Now, maybe they were traveling from a lot farther, okay? We don't know exactly when they left, but we know that it took about 2 years before the star appeared again, because now the star is appearing in verse 9. It's appearing a second time. They saw it the first time, they went to Jerusalem, and now they're departing from King Herod, and all of a sudden there's the star again, a second time. Okay, so there's 2 appearances of these stars, and the stars appear about 2 years apart. Here, I'll show you in a second. It says, and when they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. And when they were come to the house, they saw that the young child with Mary, his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures and presented to him with gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh, they were warned of God in a dream that they should not return to Herod. They departed into their country another way. Okay. So they gave gifts and then they left because they were warned in a dream, don't go back to King Herod, because you need to find another way to go back because you're in danger, basically. So anyways, in verse 13 it says, and when they departed, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, Arise and take up thy young child and thy mother and flee into Egypt, and be thou there until I bring thee word, for Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. So Herod wants to basically kill the Messiah because he's king. He wants his children to be king, and he doesn't want this Messiah to come up and take the throne from him or his heirs. Okay, so continuing on in verse 14. When he arose, he took the child and his mother by night and departed into Egypt, and was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the Lord of the Lord by the prophet, saying, Out of Egypt have I called my son. Okay, so now it says, Then Herod, when he saw that he was mocked of the wise men, and was exceedingly wroth, and sent forth to slew all the children that were in Bethlehem and in all the coasts thereof, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had diligently inquired of the wise men. Okay, so 2 years is the period that he's going to slaughter the kids, because that was the time that the wise men had first seen the star and told Herod about it. Okay, or told Herod that they'd first seen the star. Now, this part you have to understand a little bit about the geography of Jerusalem. Bethlehem is just a few miles down the road from Jerusalem. It's basically a suburb of Jerusalem. Okay, and Bethlehem is the area where they kept the sheep and the stables for the sacrifices, the daily sacrifices that were to take place in Jerusalem in the temple each day. That's where they raised them, in Bethlehem. So Bethlehem is not far at all for them to go from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. It's something they can do in a day and come back in a very short time, in a matter of, especially if you're on horseback or traveling not by foot, you can do it very, very quickly. It's basically just a commute to work, if you will. That's how close Bethlehem is to the city of Jerusalem, even in ancient times. So when Herod is saying that he was found out that he was mocked by the wise men, that they departed another way, he's not saying that he waited around 2 years and they never showed up again to say, did they find the kid or anything. He's saying right away, he knows very, very quickly, within a matter of hours, days, that the wise men did not return, and they did not report back to if they found the Messiah. The other reason why we know that is because Joseph and Mary were warned in a dream that night they had to leave. That's how quickly they had to get out of there, because Herod was going to know right away, and he was going to come and try to kill the children in that area in order to kill off the Messiah. So what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that if 2 years is the time period that Herod is killing everyone that's 2 years and younger, and he's doing that because of the that was when the Magi, or the wise men, told them they first saw the star. We know that the second appearance of the star had to happen about this time, which was 2 years after the first appearance of the star. So that's our time frame. We have 2 appearances of the Star of Bethlehem that are 2 years apart. Okay. So what we're going to look for is, if we're going to look for the Star of Bethlehem, we want to look for some sort of sign in the sky that happens 2 years apart. That's basically the same sign. Okay, and that will tell us the star rising out of Jacob that they were looking for, and that will tell us the time of the birth of Jesus. And I will show you the Star of Bethlehem right now. Okay, this is a zoomed in version, so it would actually look a little bit closer together from a distance. But when we're talking about the Star of Bethlehem, what they're talking about isn't necessarily a single star. It is a sign in the constellations to let them know when something would happen based on times and seasons and so forth. In the first chapter of the Bible, we read that God created the sun, the moon, and the stars in order to give us to keep track of hours and days and times and seasons, etc. Okay, so it was a timekeeping thing that they were looking for, and because they knew Daniel's prophecy of the 490 years, they knew that they were supposed to look for this particular time at the occurrence of the Messiah, and they would see a star to note that particular time based on the prophecy I read earlier about the star rising out of Jacob. Okay, so how did they keep time in ancient times? Well, the way they kept time was, you would have the sun, obviously, would go around, that's one day, a 24-hour period. The moon would go from a new moon to a full moon, back to a new moon again, roughly every 30 days. That's where we get our month from, a moon, a month. Okay, but there are other planets that they could follow too for timekeeping. For example, the planet Jupiter would go through the zodiac roughly once every 12 years. All right, the planet Saturn would go through it roughly every 30 years, give or take. The planet Mars every 2 years, give or take, and so on and so forth. There were actually 5 visible planets that they could keep track of times based on their cycles through the zodiac: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Okay, and then of course you had the moon would travel through the zodiac once every month, and the sun will go through the zodiac once every year. Okay, it would take 1 year for so each month the sun would be in a new sign of the zodiac from month to month to month to month. Okay, and then the zodiac itself will slowly shift over the course of 24,000 years, but that's another discussion. But basically, by combining those elements, they were able to keep time. And a sign that would appear in the heavens when you'd have a conjunction point between a bunch of different planets, they would know in ancient times that that would be a sign of something significant happening. Okay, there is a particular conjunction of 4 planets that occur that only during this time frame. The first one, and you can't really tell, but there's actually 2 planets here that are together here. So there's actually 4 in this picture, but 2 of them are joined together. The first one occurs in 2 BC and around August 26th. Okay, that's the first conjunction, and it would have been the east. So when the sun begins to rise just before dawn, they would see this star appear in the east. Okay, and that would designate that this was the time of the coming of the Messiah. That's the star that's rising up. Okay, now if we go to the next one here, this is the next star that occurs, and it occurs on occurs on November 6th, 1 AD, which is roughly 2 years, because there is no year 0. So it's roughly 2 years after the occurrence of the first star. And again, we have the same conjunction between the planets that we had 2 years earlier. So this is the sign that they were looking for. And if they were traveling on the road from Jerusalem down to, and they can only see this just shortly before dawn or shortly before sunset, depending on when the stars appear. Because if these stars are close to the sun, and it happens on one side of the sun, this conjunction, as the sun rises, the sunlight gets too bright and they cannot see those stars anymore. As if it happens shortly, these planetary conjunction happens on the other side of the sun, just before sunset. Then what happens is, as the sun goes down and you begin to see the stars, you can see this configuration, but then it'll quickly go below the horizon because the whole night sky continues to slowly move, and all the constellations will rise and set just like the sun rises and sets. So you only have two opportunities to see these stars, these morning stars and these evening stars. That is at sunrise and sunset. And so in the temple they would do the morning and evening sacrifice, and they would record these morning and evening stars for the purposes of timekeeping and astronomy and so forth. So that's how they were able to know when they were supposed to be looking for these certain signs that would appear in the heavens. And this particular stars only happen, this conjunctions only happen around this time 2 years apart. And I'm going to go to an astronomy program and I'll show you how it looks in the astronomy program. Just 1 second here. Okay, so here we are, we're in August of 2 BC. Now the reason why this is 2 BC is because you have to adjust. There is no year zero, and so as you can see in this astronomy program here, if we go through here, we're going to go from there's 180. Okay, this is actually, there's no year zero, so this is actually 1 BC, and then 2 BC. So that we're actually in 2 BC. All right. So anyways, we're going to start on August 19th, and as you notice here, if I back up the date, let's see, we'll back it up. No, I don't know. We'll go through a little bit here. Here's the sun. Okay, each day the sun is progressing along in the zodiac a little bit more. Right now it's in the constellation Leo. Okay, and as we begin to go forward here, you can see that Mars, Jupiter, the Sun, Mercury are all starting to converge together. Okay, and then all of a sudden you have this conjunction between these three planets here, and Venus is also on the same conjunction line here, because Venus, if you watch where Venus comes from, okay, so Venus is down here. It all conjoins basically around the same time on August 26th in 2 BC. Okay, that's the first image that I showed you. This is the conjunction of the stars. Hang on, I'll show you that image here. This is the conjunction that they would have been looking for, and they would have known that this is a very significant conjunction. Again, this is somewhat zoomed in, so these stars have actually appeared closer together, but if the Magi and the astronomers of their day were recording this, they would have known the significance of this event and what it was denoting, that it was for timekeeping purposes, that this is the sign that they were looking for for the 490-year prophecy for the coming of the Messiah. Okay, so one moment here. So what I want you to watch now is the significance of what is happening here. Okay, there's a constellation. First of all, this is happening in the constellation Virgo, the Virgin. Okay, the constellation above her is Leo the Lion. All right, and Leo the Lion is made up of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 stars. There's 9 stars in the constellation Leo the Lion. Okay. If we add these 3 stars here, there are 12 stars now, because 10, 11, 12. There are 12 stars directly above the head of Virgo, the Virgin, and the sun is in the house of Virgo, the Virgin. Okay. So let's go ahead in time now and watch what happens as that conjunction begins to come apart. We also have the moon entering into this conjunction at this time as well, and by about September 1st, the moon is now at her feet. So she is clothed with the sun, the moon is at her feet, and up near her head, with Leo and these stars, you have about roughly 12 stars. 13 if you count Venus, okay? But Venus is off to the side a little bit. So then during this time, as we go through the month, these stars begin to progress down the constellation Virgo until finally they exit around the end of the month when the moon begins to come out again. Okay, so let's go ahead 1 year, all right, because the sun will go through this constellation every year. All right, So if we go back to when the sun is entering Virgo, we don't have the conjunctions anymore. In year 1 BC, the planets don't. We have 2 planet conjunctions, but we don't have the multiple planet conjunctions like I showed in 2 BC. Okay, so as the sun begins to enter Virgo, we have Venus and Jupiter join together. The moon passes through, but we don't get that same conjunction between those 3 planets like we had earlier. Okay, the conjunctions are actually much more rare for that to occur. Okay, so then it progresses through. That's October. Now we go to 1 AD. All right. So let's back up here again. All right. Now Mars and Mercury, we have a conjunction between those planets. And as we progress through the course of the month, the sun passes by Mars, progresses through. Now we begin to get into the constellation of Libra. And as we do, we notice that we have the planets here are starting to come into alignment again. Venus, Mercury, Mars, Jupiter, those same 4 planets that were in the conjunction 2 years earlier, all of a sudden they're going to form another conjunction again, this time in when the sun is finally in the constellation of Scorpio. And this last conjunction happens in the constellation of Libra, which is a sign for judgment. Okay. So what happens here is the conjunction starts here, and then Jupiter continues to progress through here the following year, because Jupiter goes through one constellation per year, and then it happens again. The same conjunction happens again 2 years later, after it exits out of Virgo the Virgin. So it starts at the top of Virgo the Virgin. That's where the first sign for the conjunction occurs. It progresses over the course of 2 years through Virgo the Virgin, and then you see the sign again exiting on the other side. Now, why am I showing this? Well, I'll show you why here in a second. Let's look at the book of Revelation in chapter 12. And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. Well, what's the constellation we just looked at? We looked at Virgo the Virgin. Normally, Leo above her head has 9 stars, but when you get that conjunction between those 3 stars, there's 3 extra stars there. Now you have 12. Okay, so around her head was 12 stars, and she being with child, travailing in birth, and pained and delivered. Okay, the stars progressed. The conjunction occurred at the top of her head, and then it progressed through, and then it occurred again 2 years later at her feet. Okay, so this basically is a clock. It tells you the time. Clothed with the sun, so the sun is in that constellation at that point in time. The moon's at her feet. Okay, and at her head is a crown of 12 stars. And there appeared another great wonder in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns upon its head. Well, let's go back here and look real quick. Okay. Here's a serpent. Okay. And this is the constellation Serpents. The dragon is oftentimes considered to be a serpent. Okay. How many stars are in the head of the serpent here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. Above the head of the serpent is a crown. How many stars in this one? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. And the serpent sits at the feet of the woman, waiting for her to give birth. Let's continue to read here. And she being with child travailed, and travailing at birth pain, and she to be delivered. And there appeared a great wonder in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon its head. And his tail drew a third of the stars of heaven, and did cast them down to earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, to devour the child as soon as it was born. Okay, what happened at the time of Christ's birth? Herod was seeking to destroy all the children that were 2 years and younger. He was trying to devour the child. What happens? Mary and them flee into the wilderness in Egypt to be protected. And it says, "And she brought forth the man-child who was to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, and the child was caught up unto God and to his throne," who Jesus ascended into heaven. Okay? "And the woman fled into the wilderness, while she was prepared of God that they should feed her for 2,360 days." Now, I believe that this is not just prophetic about that particular time, because it says that the heavens, the fool has said in his heart there is no God, because the heavens declare it, basically. So that those symbols that happen at the time of the birth of Christ, there's a dual prophecy that's going on. There's also prophetic of things that would happen in the future. Okay, this isn't just pertaining to Mary at the time of birth of Christ, but this is also emblematic of the last days in the church and so forth, because there is a repetition in prophecy for things that occur in patterns. It's a patternality. Like, for example, Noah's Ark, okay, the flood. You have all the evil people, the corrupt world, that's washed away by the flood waters, and only Noah and the righteous come through on the other side. Then you carry that through to the time of Moses. In the days of Moses, he led them through the Red Sea, and Pharaoh's army is drowned in the Red Sea, and then the Israelites come out on the other side. Okay, baptism. You are sinful in your nature, you are baptized, and you're dunked in the water, you're born again, you come out as a new creation on the other side. So you see how that patternality works in different examples. I believe this is the same case here. We have something that's talking about the time that Mary gave birth to Jesus, but it's also emblematic of other things in future events as well. So it's not just to that time. Okay. So anyways, but the point I wanted to make is that it goes back to Daniel's prophecy that we're talking about with the 490 years, that this is the sign that they were looking for to know when the Messiah would come. And that only works if Daniel's 490 years occurred after the 500s AD that our history books have wrong, or 500s BC that our history books have wrong. It happened to happen. This all had to happen. The Babylonian captivity had to happen during 400s BC. Okay. Now I'm going to go give you the correct chronology, which I pieced together. Just one second here. Let me go to the spreadsheet for it. Okay. So anyways, hopefully this won't crash. Okay, so all right, here is getting back to the chronology here. So we have the time of Christ and the crucifixion and so forth. So now we're going to get into if you look at the years here, now we're getting into 91 BC, 92, 93 BC. We can follow those all the way up. We're in the Greek era, which is the Seleucid Empire and the Ptolemaic Empire. There were 4 generals that Alexander's kingdom was divided into. Two of them were fighting against each other, one in the Egyptian area, one in the north in the Babylonian era, and Jerusalem was kind of in between them all the time. So you have the king of the north versus the king of the south. And the book of Daniel talks about the prophecies of that in the last few chapters. So anyways, now we're getting to the Achaemenid Empire during the reign of, here's the time of Cyrus the Younger. So if he had a dual reign with his father, Darius III, that's the Cyrus that they're talking about. Okay, the end of the 70-year captivity, roughly around 423 BC would have been the last year, the 70th year, before the decree of Cyrus, which is probably Cyrus the Younger, to let them go. Okay. Again, in the reign of Darius II is when the temple started to be rebuilt again, around 422 BC. Okay, then we go up through the captivity here. Now, I believe that the 37th year. Now, this requires reading the Bible and a lot of different scriptures to understand these things. But Jehoiachin was or sometimes referred to as Jeconiah, was the last king of Israel before the captivity, and it says in his 37th year he was let out of his prison. Okay, I believe that's I believe that occurred in the 12th year of the reign of Xerxes. All right, and the reason why I'm saying it's the 12th year reign of Xerxes is because if we read in the book of Esther, that's about the time that the story of Purim occurred. Okay, and Mordecai was basically granted the rights of almost being a king by the emperor at that time. Okay, so I believe that that king, the first year of that reign of the king that let Jeconiah out of prison, his name is Evel Marduk in the Hebrew, but it actually translates to the soldier of Marduk, or possibly the fool of Marduk. Um, Marduk is a transliteration of the word Mordecai. It's a pagan god from that time, and Mordecai was bestowed that name by his captors. But it's Marduk and Mordecai come from the same word basically. They both are the same word basically. So what it means is that a soldier of Mordecai or a soldier of Marduk is or a king whose name was the soldier Marduk or something to that effect was the one who let Jeconiah out of prison. And this, time-wise, when we begin to line up the captivity and so forth, that would indicate this would have occurred in the 12th year of Xerxes' reign, which is the time the story of Purim occurred in the book of Esther. So that would have been Mordecai that let him out of prison. Okay. So, anyways, and you can read about that stuff in the book of Esther. But it also says that Mordecai was one of the ones taken into the captivity, and under the old way of looking at things, that would have been possible because Mordecai would have been far too old to have been taken away in the captivity. Under this system, you can see that it works perfectly that he was taken away in the captivity. So the captivity actually started around 492 BC, and that's right after the last captives were taken by Nebuzaradan. That's when the clock starts ticking. Okay. I want to show you another example why the chronology as we know it has to be wrong, and that is that it doesn't take into account co-regencies and co-reigns, because oftentimes kings and their sons would rule together, or a son would be referred to a king because he's royal, even though his father is still reigning on the throne. Okay. Let me give you one example. So the historical chronology, Xerxes is the last one that's actually correct to the historical chronology. The historical chronology will tell you that Darius the First began to reign before the start of Xerxes' reign, but in fact they were actually co-regents. And I'll show you how the history books are wrong here in just one second. Okay, here's an Egyptian hieroglyph during the reign of the Achaemenid period. It's an inscription, and the inscription, basically it's two side-by-side inscriptions written in Egyptian hieroglyphs. And the inscription on the left says, in the year of the name of Darius, basically it reads, year 36 of the good God, the Lord of the two lands, the son of Ra, Darius. Okay, so year 36 of his reign. The second column on the other side says, year 12 of his son, the Lord of two lands, the son of Ra, Xerxes. So year 36 is the year 12 of the reign of his son Xerxes. So there's a co-regency there, and we have a historical evidence to show that. This goes on to say, if Darius was already had been dead for 12 years, please also note that the identical glyphs at the very bottom of the cartouche, they read, given life like Ra forever, this is never said of dead kings. It proves that Darius and his son were alive and reigning when the inscription was made. And it proves that year 36 of Darius was year 12 of Xerxes. So let's go back to the chronology here. Now this part's going to get kind of complex if you've studied, and really will probably only make sense if you've studied the history of these empires and so forth, because, but I'm going to be throwing a lot of information here, but I do want to get it out, so at least it's on recorded for people to look at. But basically here's what I pieced together that happened. The 12th year of BC is the last couple of years of Darius the First's reign. That was the time of Purim, and Darius only reigned for a couple of years. And when I mean that he reigned for a couple of years, I'm meaning not as king, but as emperor over the whole kingdom of Babylon and everything. Okay, because there were different kings ruling different cities, but you have an overlord, an emperor that would basically was the king of kings. So when Darius assumed the throne of Babylon, this would have been around the time of this uprising in Purim, and he would have had about just a couple years here. And this is when he made an inscription called the Behestun inscription, which says that basically it only says it's talking about just a couple years that all the events of the Bestun inscription took place. Even though Darius's reign was for some 36 years prior as a king, he was emperor over Babylon and the empire only for a couple short years, and the Behistun inscription records the events that happened when he became king over Babylon and the empire. Otherwise, he would have recorded all these different events for his entire reign. He was only referring to the time when he became king of Babylon, which his reign only lasted a couple years. So anyways, this again occurs around 472 BC. So what had happened at this point, to kind of back up here, give you a little bit of the history here. Okay, so Belshazzar was a son of Nabonidus and Nebuchadnezzar, because grandson, but basically they refer to him as a son. They don't have a word for grandson in those times. To say you were a son of someone meant you could have been an ancestor, if you will. So Belshazzar was the one whom Darius II took the kingdom from in the book of Daniel. Now, the reason why Darius II ended up taking the kingdom is because this would have been around the time of the last year of the reign of Cyrus. So I believe that Cyrus was reigning as emperor. Darius was a king, but then shortly after, in the first year of Cyrus, shortly after that time, Darius basically becomes the sole ruler, because it's about that time that Cyrus, his career ends and he dies. I believe that Cambyses, his son, was a co-regent as well, and that Cambyses was the last king shortly after Cyrus, and then there was a usurper by the name of Bardiah, but then Darius, who was the son of Hystaspes, overthrew that usurper, and he became the sole king for a couple of years. So around the time of Purim is when all this is happening. There's a big transition, a big upheaval in the kingdom, which helps supplant this whole concept of Purim. The only stable king during this whole time is King Xerxes. So, and this is the time of the book of Esther. Okay. So, why do I have Cyrus and Darius and the Babylonians all reigning at the same time? Well, the reason is because the Babylonians were reigning in Babylon, and the Medo-Persians were reigning elsewhere, but the Babylonian Empire did not really give away to the Persians until 472 BC, according to this chronology that I'm putting together here. So meanwhile, even though Cyrus and the Medo-Persians are reigning in their empire elsewhere around the Middle East, the Babylonians are still reigning in Babylon for some time here, and their kingdom is, even though they're subjects and so forth, their kingdom is not really divvied up, and the province of Chaldea is not really destroyed until Xerxes comes along, and in the 12th year of Xerxes, that's when that happens. Okay, and then over the course of the rest of the time, all the way up to the return of the captivity, basically they become a non-people. I mean, they're basically disappear from the history books slowly over that 70-year period. It's like 70 years of judgment against the nation of Babylon. So, anyways, so what happens here is Darius actually became a king, not the king over the whole empire, but actually became a king around the year 507, when the Medes were still ruling under Astyages. Okay, so Darius was a king and a ruler under the Median kingdom while Astyages was reigning. However, Cyrus came along, and he beat out Astyages to take the ultimate emperor, the King of Kings title, away from the Medes, and takes it for the Persians. And that's when the Persians become the sole rulers instead of the Medes. So you had the Medo-Persian Empire, because they basically were fighting each other for that throne, that title. Meanwhile, in Babylon, you've got Nabonidus ruling, and then before him, in green here, you have Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar, okay, here's part of the problem here. Nebuchadnezzar became sole ruler after a battle called Carchemish. He himself was a king before that point, after his father Nabopolassar, but he did not assume the big throne, if you will, until this battle of Carchemish, and that was about the time that he began to take the captives of the the Jews in that were in Israel at the time and carry them off to Babylon. So when we're counting the first year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, we're counting it from two standpoints. Number one, because it's being written in the book of Daniel, we're counting it from the first year according to Daniel as his reign as king over them, but also according to the fact that he had basically won the ultimate kingdom after the Battle of Carchemish. So that's when we really got to start counting his first year. So even though Nebuchadnezzar reigned for up to 43 years as a king in Babylon, he was an emperor, if you will, only from about his 23rd year on, after the Battle of Carchemish. So, and that occurred roughly, let's see here, roughly around 515 BC is when I have that. Now, there's another key point in history, and that is a battle called the Battle of the Halys River, where there was a key eclipse. That actually occurred around 507 BC, but that's an important point in the historical record because after that battle in 507 BC, that's when the king Cyaxares of the Medes basically stopped being king, and then you had Astyages as the sole king all the way until the time that Cyrus put him in prison, which was around the 6th year of the reign of Nabonidus, and that is when the reign of the Medes basically ends, and the Persians are basically sole rulers now. And then Cyrus, who's the head of the Persians, a few short years later, he completely defeats Nabonidus and his son Belshazzar. That's shortly at the end of his reign, and then Darius the First takes over. Okay, so that's what's really going on here in history. We're not putting Cyrus before Darius, and we're not putting Darius before Xerxes. All this is kind of going on at the same time. And if you begin to piece together the Bible events, you'll see that all these pieces fit together fairly perfectly. Now, what about that tablet that I was talking about earlier, where we're talking about the 37th year of Cyrus for that astronomical tablet at the beginning of the video? As I said, that was a copy of an earlier tablet. I don't believe it actually is referring to the 37th year of, of Nebuchadnezzar, but it was instead referring to the 37th year, once we piece all these pieces of the puzzle together, of an earlier king by the name of Ashurbanipal. Because it has to be in 568 BC when that tablet occurred, because that's when those conjunctions and so forth that are recorded on the astronomy happened. And I did check that up on the astronomy program, so it has to be at this time. There's no other possibility when you really get into it. 568 BC, when you begin to piece this all together and add up the reigns of the kings, happens to be the 37th year of the reign of Ashurbanipal. So there again, well, it's the 37th year. That's kind of an odd coincidence. This chronology has to be correct once you piece these together. The other reason why it has to be correct is because if you begin to add up the dates of the Hebrew kings in the Bible and their corresponding Assyrian and Medo-Persian and Babylonian kings that they're interacting with, when you begin to add up their reigns for the Hebrew kings and the reigns for the Assyrians and Babylonians, it forces this configuration to happen, because as you go back in history, you will see that these kings had to reign in conjunction with the Hebrew kings only during these times, which means that the Babylonian captivity had to occur later in history. It had to occur in the 400s, not 500s. Otherwise, the biblical record and the historical record wouldn't match up. They wouldn't be contemporaries of each other if you didn't do it this way. It forces it to be this way, and once you look at it, you realize that that is the truth, that this is really what the real chronology is. So let me go forward here. What that also tells us is that the Assyrian Empire and Nineveh ended a little bit later too. Nineveh fell around 547 BC, and so that is the time of the fall of the Assyrian Empire, and that when Nineveh fell, basically it was a conglomeration of the Persians, the Medo-Persians, and the Babylonians and so forth that joined up to destroy the Assyrian hegemony out of Nineveh. And there was a contract or a covenant that was made between the Babylonians and the Medo-Persians, where one of the daughters of the kings of the Medo-Persians was given to Nebuchadnezzar as a wife in order to cement their relationship between the two kingdoms. And Nebuchadnezzar, his wife was very homesick for Medo-Persia, and because of the lush green foliage and so forth. So Nebuchadnezzar, in order to solve that, built the Hanging Gardens of Babylon in order to cement that relationship. Well, the reason why they're teaming up is because they're going after the Syrians in order to take on Nineveh, and so that had to happen about this time. Okay, and Nebuchadnezzar, of course, is the one that took the Israelites into captivity. So therefore, all of this has to match up. The astronomical record records it. The historical record records it. This is the way it has to be. Now, there's another interesting item too, which is the some of the Elephantine chronicles and so forth that detail a high priest by the name of Hanan, or it will say Johanan, but actually it's referring to a priest. Well, I'll get into that, but it shows a high priest that isn't actually listed in if you look at the list of the high priests on Wikipedia and so forth. But his name was Hanan, and then there's another Johanan that occurs much later, after the time of Artaxerxes the second or the third, for which there was a coin that's found that says during the high priest of Johanan. And those are two different people. I have to get into that in perhaps another video, but it deals with after the captivity occurred and some of the Israelites left in the land went down to Egypt, and they worshipped basically Ashtaroth. They were baking cakes to the Queen of Heaven. There's a temple down there, and the high priest in Jerusalem at that time, basically at the start of the Babylonian captivity, would have been this Hanan, not Johanan, and he is the one that that they didn't get to hear back from when they wrote him to ask about rebuilding their temple down in Egypt. So, but that's another video. I'm getting kind of way off sidetrack here. So, anyways, as we continue to go through history here, you will see the chronology here, and if you want, I can provide you with more information on this if you're interested in finding out about this chronology. I'm going to kind of follow back here. Now, the other, I can go all the way back to the start of creation with this. And here, again, this is taken from the Bible, the books of Kings and Chronicles. It will say this king for the Israelites began to rule in such and such year for this king for the kingdom of Judah. If you match these up, it forces the chronology. It's the only time that these kings can possibly have reigned. It all fits together like a giant jigsaw puzzle. So as we continue to go back in history, we will find not only the time of the Exodus, we'll find the time when the first temple was actually built and so forth, the time of the reigns of David and Solomon. So let's see here, Solomon, his last year was around 886 BC. So the first temple was actually completed around 915 BC, thereabouts. And so if you go back again when we're talking about Darius II, it says that the second temple was completed in the 6th year of the reign of Darius II, which had been around 416 BC. So if the second temple is rebuilt around 416 BC, which is about 6 years into the reign of Darius II, the first temple here is completed around 916 or 915 BC, thereabouts. So we're talking about basically 500 years after, almost exactly, between the two temples, as far as they're being completed, which is rather interesting. It's a round number like that, but there's a lot of round numbers when you begin to piece this stuff together. Usually around like 430, 420 years apart, 490. You begin to run to that all the time when you start piecing this stuff together. So the temple was actually started around 922 BC, the first temple. Then we get into the reign of David, the reign of Saul, So let's see, then we get into the time of judges here. All this is, like I said, I've pieced all this together and can show proofs for it. So we're going to continue to go. I'm going to start skipping ahead a little bit more quickly here. Okay, so then we have the conquest of Canaan, the Battle of Jericho, which would have occurred around 1361, 1362, somewhere in there. That would have been the time of the Battle of Jericho, BC. Then you had the 40 years in the wilderness, and then you have the around 1402 BC is when the Exodus occurred. So we have the date for that. And then let's keep going forward here. We have the time that they're in Egypt, and they're in Egypt 300 years. I actually have another video that explains why it's 300 years. You can take a look at that. They actually went into Egypt, let's see here, 430 years after the birth of Jacob is when they exited Egypt. They were in Egypt 300 years, and Jacob went into Egypt when he was 130 years old. So let's see here. Then you have the time of Jacob's trouble, the time of the affliction, which is the 20 years he was working for Laban. Let's see. Then going into the birth of Jacob. Jacob was born around 1831, 1832 BC. And we're continuing with the patriarchs here. I have the Tower of Babel roughly around 2000 BC. And then I have the flood around 2311 BC, thereabouts, give or take a year. And then we get into the Old Testament, the age of the patriarchs and so forth. And there's one patriarch we have to kind of add from the Septuagint and then make some adjustments based on logical deduction as to the number of years that he actually reigns as the name of Kenan. But when we add that in, we come to the year of the creation, which is about 3967 BC. And when you add all this together, and it has to add this way because it's a jigsaw puzzle, and all the pieces have to fit, okay? When you add this together, hang on one second here, I'm going to show you the day of creation on the astronomy program. So let's go to 3967. 3967. Oops, that's 1 year. Okay, 3967 BC. Which, sorry, that's actually 3968. So let's go to. Now remember that the first year is in the spring. Okay, so this is 3967 BC. Okay. Now, one thing we have to note here is that in the year 1582 thereabouts, they actually took 10 days out of the calendar. So there is an adjustment for that, but if you take that into account, you're still at the year 3967 BC, because again, there's no year zero, roughly around April 10th of that year. And again, there's a 10-year offset that you may have to take into account because of that change in the calendar, going from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar. Okay, this is what you would have seen at dawn, basically, and I don't have the ground in here. Let me put the ground in real quick. So I'm going to go here and landscape, and we are going to add the ground. I'm not going to add the atmosphere, just so you can kind of see everything that's on here. But let's go ahead and bring up dawn. Here we are looking at the east, and here is the first day, or possibly the fourth day, because the sun, moon, stars were created on the fourth day. So depending on your interpretation of this, but this is the time of creation. So what do we see in the constellation here? This is the first month of the year, which is the constellation Taurus. When the sun is in Taurus, that is the start of the ancient new year. Okay. Unless they add a leap month, which they have to do on the calendar sometimes. So the first month of the year, first when we go back to this date in according to the chronology, forces us to do this. What do we see here? We see a major conjunction. We have a new moon first of the month, starting right at the beginning of sunrise. Perfectly configured here. The planets are there. We have Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, and Mars, all within the constellation in a conjunction here, all within Taurus. And then we have Mercury and Venus that basically give us the length of one constellation. So it denotes how far the constellation is supposed to be apart. And then we have the conjunction in the middle, right in the head of Taurus, all centered between the length of one constellation here. So perfect for starting out to tell time. One planet that's missing is Saturn, which is basically at the complete opposite end of the spectrum here. And I'll have to let me bring up Saturn here if I can. Okay, here's Saturn. Saturn is in Libra, the constellation Judgment, completely at the opposite end of the zodiac. Okay, and what does Saturn stand for? Well, the planet, the days of the week are named after the planets. Monday for the moon, Sunday for the sun, so on and so forth. Saturday for Saturn. So in Hebrew or in Judaism, Saturday is the Sabbath day. It's the day that's set apart, this day of rest. So we have on the very first day of creation, we have all the planets and so forth together, and then Saturn, which is designated for Saturday, is set apart. It's the seventh day. That's the day of rest. And this all fits in perfectly with the start of creation on that chronology, all the way going down through history all the way till today. Now, what else is interesting about that is this year, 3967. This is exactly 4,000 years before the crucifixion. If you take, hang on here. So let's go ahead and go 39. It might be 3968 actually, because again, that's the time of the new year. So if this is day 4 of creation, then the first 3 days actually occur in technically year 3968, because the first year starts in the spring. So let's go 3968. We're going to subtract 4,000. 33 AD, because there's no year 0. Okay, if it's 3967, then it's year 34 AD. Okay, so again, 4,000 years before the time of the crucifixion. All right, 2,000 years or so, you had the time of the Tower of Babel. So again, the days of the week, you have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and then you have the seventh day that's set apart. It says that the day to the Lord is 1,000 years. It says that when Christ returns, there will be 1,000 years of peace. 1,000 years where he reigns on earth. So the question is, if creation is 4,000 years before the time of Christ, what is and each day is 1,000 years? What is the sixth day before the day of rest, before the 1,000-year reign of Christ comes? Well, 2,000 years after the crucifixion would give you that answer. So roughly around 2032, 2033. Would suggest that is approximately the start of the return of Christ and when the 1,000-year reign of peace starts. However, keep in mind that there's the whole concept of the tribulation period and possibly coming 7 years beforehand. So we might be talking about 2025, somewhere around there, is when the start of all the tribulation and possibly the return of Christ and the rapture and everything else, depending on your theology. However, the time of Jacob's trouble, if you know, you can look at my other videos regarding that, but the time of Jacob's trouble is actually 20 years, referring to the time that he served for Laban, for his wives and the cattle and so forth, because Jacob is the nation of Israel. If it's 20 years, then the tribulation may actually last from about 2025 up to 2045 or something to that effect. So again, that depends on your theology, but the other thing to note with that is Jacob was about 77 years old when he went to get his bride, okay, and the start of that time of Jacob's trouble. Jacob is the nation of Israel. Well, the nation of Israel was reborn in 1948. So let's do 1948 plus 77, 2025. We just talked about 2025, which is about 7 years before the time of Christ. Jacob, when he went to get his bride, and Christ is going to return for his bride in the future, that's the prophecy. When Jacob went to get his bride, he had to work for her for 7 years. He ended up working for Leah for 7 years, which is the bride after the law. and then he worked 7 more years for the bride he loved, and then he worked 6 more years for the cattle and so forth. So if that's the 7-year tribulation period, could start about 2025, could start about 10 years from now. Now it's interesting to note I'm actually making this video right now as I'm finishing this up. I'll show you here. It is here is when I'm making this video, folks, just so you can see. Okay, Friday 2:17 a.m. in the morning. It is Friday the 20th of March. That's when I happen to be coincidentally making this video. So here's one I'll show you now. Okay, you might have heard about the blood moons and so forth, and that is the actual time and date. So hold on a second here. Blood moon tetrad. Okay, so let's see if I can find something on that here. Just one second here. We're going to go to images. Okay, here's, we can take any of these here. Okay, if you've studied, you can go on the internet and find out about the blood moon prophecy. The 4 blood moons and the eclipse and so forth. They're occurring at this time on the feasts, the holidays of the Old Testament. So you have Passover, the first blood moon in 2014. The next to happen on the holiday of the Jewish holiday of Sukkot, and you have an eclipse, a total eclipse, which is happening right now, March 20th. And there's the date, March 20th. It's about 2:20 in the morning. I'm making this video. And then the next one occurs on Passover, and the next one in 2015, and the next one occurs on Sukkot in 2015. And you can look up about this blood moon prophecy. So let me go real quick here, and I'm just going to see when that eclipse occurs. NASA eclipse. Let's see, we're going to look up eclipses of 2015. There we go, total solar eclipse, March 20th, 2015. Oops, I'm going to reload this here. Try to zoom in so I can see this. Okay, it occurs at, the greatest eclipse occurs at 9:46 Universal Time. So I am on Central Time. So let's see, Universal Time I believe is Greenwich Mean Time. So let's change date and settings here. We're going to go to, hang on a second. Additional time clocks, I'm going to Universal Time. We're going to set that at 0 because we want to find out what time is Universal Time. So any of these will work. We'll do Dublin. Okay, show this clock. So we're only going to show, well, there's Jerusalem. It's 2 hours ahead. So Dublin, Edinburgh. Okay, that one's going to be Universal Time. I'm just doing this because I'm curious to see myself. Here's, is that right? Hang on, I gotta double check this. Additional clocks. Okay, yeah, it's the name of the clock I have is London. All right, well that's correct then. So London would be the time for Universal Time. We're gonna look up this eclipse here. Oops. Okay, so that's this clock here, London, and 6, 7. So right now it's 7:21 a.m. The strongest point is about 2 hours from now, 2.5 hours from now, roughly. So at 9:46 a.m. So I don't know what time that eclipse starts, but it'll take me probably a couple hours just to get this long video uploaded to YouTube because it's already on 2 hours. But anyways, so this video should be just in time for the eclipse. Kind of a nice little coincidence on this whole thing. So anyways, but yeah, we're going on 2 hours here, and that's kind of the gist of it. again, the point of the whole thing, and there's so much more I could go into, especially on the astronomical stuff. I mean, I can show you, astronomical things that match up with the times given in the Bible for the Noah's flood, for example, and things that are going on in the sky at that time. There's just a lot of other areas I could get into, but important thing to note here is that, number one, the Bible is true. History supports it when you actually get into it. And number two, most importantly, that because it's true, we also know that Jesus is going to return in our lifetime. And that's something that if you're not a Christian, you need to get born again. You need to prepare for that. And that's the main purpose of this video. You need to know Jesus. So it's very late here, and I'm kind of dragging on, rambling a little bit, but I will try to pick this up again in future videos. If you have any questions, please leave comments in the box, the YouTube box below. Otherwise, you can go to grailtruth.com. I'll be more than happy to answer questions there or discuss anything. But I appreciate you watching the video, and I will see you next time. Thanks.